All right. Hi, look at this. It's been so long. I feel like I'm a stranger to all of you. Now, there you go. There's my contact information if anybody wants it. Now it's out in the public domain. So I'm going to talk about warfare. And this is a pretty interesting topic. I've actually done this talk just once before, expanded on it a little bit since then, and sort of breaking it apart. And the first half of that being, see if this little clicker works. Hang on. Stand by. It's not really much magic in the drama if the little forward clicker doesn't work. There we go. Much better. Conventional. Fairly easy to understand. We'll talk about that a little bit, but certainly I wouldn't imagine new to most people versus cyber. And that's the other side of this. So what do we really look at from the difference in application, where this goes, where it came from, rules, boundaries, implications, things of that nature. So we'll walk through that. So I like this quote, in war, whichever side may call itself the victor, there are no winners. And it was this guy, Neville Chamberlain, said a few years ago. I think it's pretty profound when you think about war in general, that really even those that claim that, not really true. I don't seek, or we will not seek to win what has become in the cyber realm a perpetual war, but really engage in every conflict to the best of our abilities. I think this is the different sort of saying of this, right? So we minimize impact to our business and really our daily lives. And that was this guy down here. Well, the first time I ever said that. So a little bit about me. Started in this industry quite a while back. I am the youngest of 11 children. So that is, I'm a recovering Catholic. I have enough Catholic guilt to fill the room. So if anybody wants to blame me for things, I'm happy to take that. I do reside in Cloud City up in Seattle. It's certainly named that for a couple of reasons now. I started in technology way back. So I started out as a CAD programmer, for those familiar with CAD/CAM. It's fascinating even to this day. And really the fundamental problem we were trying to solve was that CAD files and CAM files were so big that we were zipping them onto floppy disks, and the stack of floppy disks got so big it was painful to keep them in order and move around. So I asked the person who owned the company, there was this thing called Windows 3.1 moving to 3.11. I said, do you mind if I build a network on my time? And sure, that's great. So that's how it started. 4 years really talking to Fortinet. One of the funny points there, I joined Juniper the week before Juniper acquired NetScreen, which was Fortinet's first company. It doesn't matter. I didn't get my master's degree, and I really do think that's important, only in the fact of not for me, but just the idea that education is constant, right? This shouldn't be a thing that starts and stops. Especially in this industry, it has to continue. It is in perpetuity. We always have to be learning because the adversaries are constantly growing, learning, adapting. So war, what's it good for? What are the motivations? Really, if you look at just war in general, what are some of these motivations? Resources. Oil. Money. Minerals. Oil. This comes up a lot. It's very common. Geography. You know, we just want to own a new piece of geography. We like that. We want a seaport. We want something closer, I don't know, sunnier, whatever it is. Neighbor influence. Like to be closer to an ally, further away from an adversary. This really happens. Social status. People go to war. War happens. Probably not as much as anymore, but arguably, for the idea of a pure social status. Alliances. I mean, too many people are familiar with this guy, but how do we establish that? And what type of alliances happen inside of this transaction? Civil unrest. This has become more and more popular as of late, right? The Arab Spring, the idea that it's almost a societal reset. It's a rebalance of society or an economic pieces, political shift in itself. So this is sort of new to the idea of warfare. We'll break down this a little bit from motivations, but you know, you think of the chaos that oftentimes is not, it can be the precursor and the outcome to what is traditional war, and that parallels cyber warfare in some of these instances. So who makes the rules? And this is, I think, a really interesting topic that a lot of people don't talk about enough in the cyber realm, but who makes the rules in the cyber world? There is no central agreement. There is no standard rule of engagement. But it's not an easy question. If you look back in the physical realm, in the conventional warfare, if you look up this guy, Francis Lieber, really started with the idea of how do we treat people? Like, what are the rules of warfare? Prisoners of war, how do we deal with spies? Lincoln tended to be a pretty big fan and signed this for the Civil War, but it gave that basic construct of who's battling who, what happens when people fall out of that, what happens, who is involved with it. You can see how long ago this was that we were establishing very clear guidelines and boundaries for traditional war. This is not 1963, this is 1863, and it goes back before that. The Hague Conventions, many people are familiar with these. There were a couple of them, 1899, 1907. They had planned to do another one 8 years later. Times got a little busy. You can imagine what that was. Really 12 expansive treaties, and it was this idea, again, of refining that in a global realm of how do you engage in war? What happens if you have a spy? How do you treat a prisoner of war? Who is a spy? Where does information come and go? I think the funniest part of that was new rules for aerial vessels. Yeah, they're talking about balloons. Like, can you really fly a balloon and drop warfare? Yeah, they brought that up. That's how structured this has come from. And what I think is most popular to most people is Geneva Convention. Most people think of this in the latter terms, but this goes back really into that 1860s. Multiple meetings, a very broad audience, a treatment of individuals and neutral parties. They really wanted to talk about that in the Geneva Convention. Not a surprise given where it was held. Most reference the 1949 event. So end of World War II, this is where people really came together and both put in some penalties and structuring, but also talked about how do we solidify this and make sure that war of this category or of this scale doesn't ever happen again. And if you look at the Red Cross really calls that the cornerstone of contemporary international humanitarian law. That really has become what people reference for the Geneva Convention. So what are people looking for? They're looking for a pot of gold. And if you look at these in comparison between the conventional warfare, very few people, if we look back from a time perspective, very few people in very small, isolated places. You built a castle, you built a keep, you put all your stuff there, and people would try to fight or take it over and get it. I think if you take this back as far as you can go in the cyber realm, it doesn't look too dissimilar to that. A few banks, a few institutions that had mainframe computers, they put information there. It's relatively well secured from a modern concept and modern construct. But this starts to shift, right? Now we get a feudal system. And if you move this out, we now have the idea that services are provided, services are layered. We've got wealth being a little bit more distributed. I would argue still not a lot. If you follow this parallel, certainly in a different timeline in the cyber convention, you have an idea of a data center, right? We're going to put information. Information is money. Information is power. We put it inside of a data center. You introduce the PC, and this shifts everywhere. You introduce banking in the stock market, and this goes everywhere. Whether you own stocks or not, you probably own a portfolio, a retirement account. Wealth is then more distributed. And I think completely distributed moves all the way out to the end. Whether you're a believer in cryptocurrency or not, whether it happens today, tomorrow, 10 years, it is the reality that soon, in my belief, but at least eventually, you will be able to transfer money from one person or entity to another without going through a financial institution. That is the epitome of complete distribution. Good, bad, right or wrong, it's not the point. And then you look at this in the cyber world, what you really come back to now are these massive cloud companies. There's 4 of them, really 3 competing with each other. We all know them. And they compete. And now they say, well, this information is everywhere, but yet you don't really care. As an end user, it's just distributed. It's in the cloud. We hear it all the time. It's just in the cloud. There's increasing value, but there's also increasing opportunity. in each of these when you're looking at these pot of gold, so to speak. So who's engaged? I'd say first and foremost, if you go back, wind the time clock back, who's engaged? Neighbors. Who are you going to fight in medieval times other than the person who's near you? You know, it's a day's horse ride away to get 20 miles. So you're going to fight with your neighbors. Awareness is minimal, information is minimal, mobility is very minimal. And then that starts to expand. Now we get proximity. Information spreads, various means. If you take it back to, World War I, World War II, we've got some information spreading. We get a little bit more physical mobility. And nation states really start to form. And we get this idea that now neighbors fight with and for and against other neighbors. Now I would say it's everybody. And on a scale that is never before known. Really, who is engaged in cyber conflict? All of us. We all have resources to protect, assuming that you don't drive a vehicle with no technology, live in a home with no technology, not engage with anyone with a credit card or information. You are engaged in what is modern cyber warfare. Everyone. So let's look at some of the key players. It's clear for conventional warfare. You have generals, you have people that run military, you have components of this. In the cyber world, it's not. Is it leaders or nations? Good or bad, right or wrong? There's a notable gap here. And I think this is probably one of the most pivotal elements, is there is not a nation or a treaty or a standard guideline for the world to say this is cyber conflict. There are some loose gentlemen's agreements, for lack of a better term. There are things that people know they probably shouldn't do. But there's really a gap here, fundamentally, and I do think that's a big challenge. And there's really very few people willing to step up. It'll probably, if you follow some models, assume that there's a for-profit organization, but what's their motivation? Likely the same thing that other people want to steal. So that's not an easy problem. The guardians. And I really think that is this audience. That's us. That's the people who have to take the responsibility to keep up with technology. And honestly, it's not an easy task. It's getting more and more difficult. How do you stay relevant? Technology is advancing faster than anybody would have predicted. And the public. Joe Public. These are people who use technology, embrace technology, love technology. We, as the guardians, need to provide some level of safeguard. We really do. Relying on for-profit companies and organizations to either pretend or to try to safeguard people is simply not going to work. I think we've seen it fail, and I think we're going to see it fail miserably in the years to come with technology companies that will just use everything at their will to monetize people. So those, really from the outset, we have this gap. We have these fundamental gaps in how we deal with this problem. Best practices, it's the very least we can do. And I'll close on that idea in a little bit, but the idea that at the very least, all of us as technology professionals need to both practice and to preach what it is that people should be doing. They aren't going to know. They're not curious and they don't care. It's our job to educate and evangelize the idea that you should care. You should have a password. You should lock things down. You shouldn't use that password. It is all of these things we've heard 1,000 times and we're numb to them. People need to hear them. So we look at the battlefields. Now we know the people and we say, well, where do these things fight? Again, we go back to this castle or a keep, very limited geography, organized groups, soldiers that said, you're here, fight the people there, take that land, draw the line. It's pretty simple, right? Again, go back to this mainframe, data center computing, relatively simple. I'm not trying to oversimplify it for those that were there or the nostalgic perspective, but in reality, resources lived in a very small place, a small diameter. And I do believe there's fundamentally an inflection point that happened, and that was where the battlefield unhinged from a specific location. Conventionally, we learned to bring war everywhere and anywhere. And on the cyber realm, we distributed it. It's a PC. Anybody. It's a Raspberry Pi. So anybody can own a device to hack, whatever you want to do. And now we walk around with supercomputers. We all have them. We use them constantly. So think of what that does to the overall construct of vulnerability and attackability. What are some of the common elements between these two? Training and readiness. I don't think anyone would question how much the military trains and prepares. It's basically what they do constantly. Always discipline and hygiene. For those that have served in the military, past or present, this is what the military does. Do things predictably, at scale, repeatedly. That is a tremendous source and a tremendous power that we don't have in the cyber realm. What we do are the things we need to leverage. Business continuity planning. This matters. I'm blown away by the number of organizations that I'll talk to that what happens if this facility goes away? What happens if these resources are no longer reachable? What happens if ransomware comes in and locks down this specific database? No plan. No backup. Wow. That is a fundamental flaw. That is one of the first steps that should be in business. System updates and patching. We could preach this forever. It matters. And knowing what's out there. Another that I think is fundamental and just mind-blowing of how few people know what's on their network. How many systems? How many users? How many endpoints? I don't know. What operating systems? We're not sure. Fundamental. If you're talking about this from a cyber perspective, a platform like a SIEM, security and event management, is crucial. Knowing what the battlefield is the first step to any engagement, conventional or cyber. So what are some of the weapons, some of the tactics? Destroy. I think early on, conventional war, what did you do? You stormed a castle and you burned it down. It's visible. You win, they lose. Pretty basic. I don't think you get too much simpler than that. I think in the cyber realm, I would argue or compare that this is DDoS. Make it not work. I don't really care in the early stages. Most people didn't do this for hacktivism or some sort of notoriety. They just went, I don't like that website. They ripped me off, or I don't like their message. I just want to take it out. I just want to DOS it. Yeah, okay. We started to distribute that. And the idea in the conventional sense is that we look at damaging targets, usually massive damage to larger targets. And on the cyber side, what do we get? Right? We've got people that are distributed now, but weren't really that well organized. You got script kiddies, you got people that'll run things or download malware. Are they still dangerous? Yeah. Are they still present? Sure. But it doesn't really go to the idea where you start to reach next. Right? Strategic targeting, strategic destruction on the conventional side. Organized hacker groups, for profit, for fun, for notoriety, fundamental change. And now if you think about conventional warfare, what we do, we hire. We hire mercenaries, we hire third parties. Oftentimes nations want to be abstracted from the dirtiness of war, so they hire groups and organizations that will go in and do it for them. We have state agencies, for-profit companies that will hack, that will take out services, take out systems, obtain information, blow open databases so they can, for whatever the reason. And the complexity in the design and delivery is exponential. Think of how simple it was to send people in to burn down a castle versus build a laser-guided bomb that took out a specific bridge and didn't hurt, that didn't target the families and houses that were next to it. That's fundamentally different. And the same idea here, that if you had a college campus and you could take over enough computers, you could probably DOS somebody. That was a big thing. Now you think, there's agencies, there's buildings of people that do just that. And one of the biggest attributes of this that I think is profound in the cyber realm is the removal of detection and liability. You don't see this for most scenarios in conventional warfare. If you bomb somebody, unless you're in the terrorist realm, and usually then they take credit or someone points credit, you still have liability. In the cyber realm, this is almost disappearing. The idea that someone could hack a database, take that information and supply it to someone else, we could have conjecture of who did that, but it's oftentimes impossible to prove, which really makes this a very different battlefield. So again, if we go back to some of these common elements from weapons and from these tactics, is visibility. There's no question. Number one, you can't fight what you don't see. How do we do that in the cyber world? It's got to be knock-sock. It's got to be beyond broken, fixed. I used to joke, I ran a network operations center for level 3 for a number of years, and it was red bad, green good, make red green, get a banana, right? That was it. It can't be that simple. It isn't about taking systems offline. It isn't about making things look like they're broken. Oftentimes, the worst compromised systems are the ones you don't know about. Of course, that's the idea. Being clandestine. You have to start out with inventory, knock-sock, these tools. Identity. I talk about this a lot, and I think it is the fundamental of cybersecurity that we are behind. And that is the idea that you cannot have security without a real identity platform. How do you know who to grant access to in your zero trust network if there's no identity? A machine? Maybe. A MAC address? Weak. So how do you do this in the cyber side? I think it's actually easier. This is certainly flawed in the physical realm. In the cyber realm, we can do this. Identity's everywhere. It's a piece of information that we assign to a person, to a machine, to a service. We can do this. And fundamentally, this creates what is the access control. Physically, well, that's pretty easy. There's a guard, check an identity, you get access. If you look in the cyber realm, it's got to be network access control. My personal belief is this is going to be the largest growth segment in cybersecurity in the next 2 to 3 years. Because we've built, in most cases, secure networks and infrastructures. We still have work to do and room to grow in the idea of segmenting them and isolating them, but controlling who gets access onto the network, where they go, and not just assuming that's a one-time thing. I log on with someone's password or something in a credential and I'm here. Now, what are you doing? Monitoring what someone's doing, taking that behavior, comparing it to what they should be doing, and then adjusting their access control based upon that. If I install a printer on a network and it has a MAC address of a printer, but calls out to multiple command and control servers, it's not a printer. And we shouldn't give it access to other things that it could have vulnerabilities for. So how do we measure success? So this is all for, right? Whether you go to war in any sense, you want success. Surrender, isolation, right? If you were fighting somebody in the conventional sense in the earliest realm, you really just wanted people to surrender. Raise the white flag, no more fighting, I've conquered you. And I think this was similar in the idea of cyber, in the idea of just take out a service. Again, denial of service, it's not there. It moved along or evolved in the idea of asset destruction. Taking something and not saying, well, you're surrendering, but I'm reducing your capacity. Whether that's transportation, manufacturing, fundamental certainly in modern wars, getting data out. This is a really big part of digital forensics, but the idea of just pure information extraction. How do we get it? How do we get that information from the victim out to the perpetrator? And this is really the measure of success, is how much we can get, where we can do it, and if you got detected. Now it becomes very strategic. I mean, if you look at modern conventional warfare, it involves a tremendous amount of cyber information. And I think one of the most interesting things is this scope of impact and the difficulty to detect. I talked about that. But probably the ultimate in this is that the fundamental goal of most conventional warfare now is to knock out your cyber capabilities. I mean, if you go take and launch a war against an adversary, one of the first things that a military will do is say, take out their communications, take out their ability to strike back, and that's almost completely pinned to cyber. So ironically, these two things grown in parallel paths have really merged to an idea that what are we really trying to do? We're trying to stop information, either falsify it, steal it, or prevent someone from spreading it on their own behalf. What are these elements of the success? Detection. How do we detect things? Again, physical, conventional war. It's on a radar, it's on a screen, we know it. In the NOC, we need this idea, and I think this is underdeveloped, the idea to do active defense. We do the idea of decoys in traditional warfare. They're expensive. It's cheaper to do in the cyber realm. The idea of honeypots have been around for a long time. They haven't really been evolved that much, and I really think there's a great potential here to make this better. Actively decoy. Seek out people trying to enter and do nefarious things inside of a network so that you can take action upon them proactively before they really get to a system and cause damage. And then damage assessment. If it's physical, it's usually pretty obvious. If it's digital, what do we do? Orchestration, automation, and response. Another growth area, I think, in cyber is this idea that we get an alert, it goes into a SOC, it says a system's been compromised or something's wrong or there's been an incident, and we start to dig. We investigate, we go into one system, we go into another system, we try to isolate that system from the overall network, but there's no real automation to it, and I think fundamentally this will be the way that we tackle this at scale. It's got to be a better way than just, here's a console, look for an alarm, isolate, try to remediate. So automation and response, I think, will really be a fundamental growth factor or a growth effort in the cyber warfare realm. So I'm going to close with a couple of these. Not real ideas, new to most of you, I hope. Plan and train. That idea of business continuity. I can't say this enough that I have the luxury of talking to a lot of different customers of a lot of different size and scope and scale. Again, just planning what they do. It doesn't mean that you have a whole organization that are dedicated and full-time and spit out printer reports versus, no, just have an idea. Think about it. Have a day, plan for it, because it's going to happen. Just as anything else in the course of business, this is going to happen. Research. Again, I'm befuddled by the idea that most organizations spend no time or effort into things like this. I think this is fantastic that you all as individuals, as professionals, talk about the things that are relevant, the things that are here and threats to our day-to-day business, our well-being.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What's your preferred source of media for when you do your research?
You know, it's a good question. I think there now is so much out there. It depends on your role in it. I think as if you're looking at just the public and consuming, pick just a few basic, science X, kind of this idea of just here is a mass of information, filter through as you like, find what's interesting. I think the more specialized you get, then you end up, whether that's a vendor supplied or a consortium supplied. And to some people that may just be, maybe you want your own threat feed. I mean, that's not to say that's wrong. That's probably pretty far on the nerd scale for most people. But if that's where you feel that that's the best source, I think as long as you know it's an arbitrary and not sponsored by, or if it is sponsored by that you know it, then it's a benefit either way. Identity and inventory. I think I beat that one. It's very real though. If you don't have an identity solution inside of an organization, which that should include multi-factor, but should just include an identity database, a user database that can be used for access control. Visibility. You've got to be able to see what's broken and what's not. Access control. Dictate and adjust policies. So we've come from the era that I've been in this industry now long enough to joke about X many years ago, we were happy just to get things connected. We were happy that a network worked. Then we were really happy because we got it to be 10 gig connected. And then the next response was, oh crap, it's 10 gig connected. Now it's about isolation. We've got to know what is where, how it's isolated, and know that I think the era we live in now is that policy, security policy, and access policy, the knowledge that they're not static. I think that's the big sort of societal shift, fundamental shift that we're in for right now. People don't argue that they should have a hardened perimeter and they should have access controls. These are things most people go, yeah, yep, they'll nod their head. They'll say they have budget or there's time and there's effort. The thing that people struggle with is knowing that this isn't static. And it never again will be. Have targets. Again, surprising how many companies, if you ask, what is your goal? Well, perfect security. There's no such thing. Right? We're just never going to get hacked. We're never going to have a problem. That's not possible. If you are, great. You've flown under the radar, congratulations. But at least have a target to identify what success is. And then the last one, education. And this again, as the guardians, as the stewards of information in this industry, it's part of our, I won't call it a burden, I'll call it the pleasure of sharing this information with other people, especially those that are proven to be curious, that they want to know and they want to learn, and educating them that this is part of their job. Do I really have to take the email phishing security quiz? That seems silly when you're in the industry, but if you're someone who doesn't and isn't aware, it's real. So helping people, as technology professionals, it's easy for us to kind of poke fun and say, that's this thing you've got to take. But if you take a different tone and you encourage people to do it out of the goodness for what they do, it changes the whole idea. People get motivated when they know that there's a goal and a resource for it versus, it's just this arduous task I have to click through. And hygiene is always the best medicine. I can't leave any conversation without saying that to people. I heard it mentioned numerous times here today, and it's real, right? Patch, update, know the systems that are there. It does matter. It's very, very real. Almost every major breach we see is because of some system that had a vulnerability that people knew about for days, months, years beforehand. It matters. And I made my little private acronym. I had to move these around for like 6 times just to get that out. Make my own acronym. So that's it. So I thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for the time.